Okay, today is March 25th, 2024, and for the forms class, I wanted to talk about the 22LA. Now, this form is an all-encompassing form. It's one of those forms that when your buyer doesn't know what they want to do and has no idea where to start, it might be one of the forms you pull out because it has so many different options and so many different uses. The purpose of the form itself actually applies to any property that you can check a box for. And with all the choices in there, there might be something that applies that might not necessarily be because of land. This could be residential. There could be a number of things that this is used for. Not all contingencies are the same on this form as they are with their separate forms. However, it does let your buyer go through and assess things like the septic and the water quality. So for the purpose of the form today, I just bullet pointed a few of those things, but if you need attorney review, feasibility, basically to negotiate who pays on some of these things, because some of our other addendums don't actually offer that option. If you plan on doing an assignment, if there's any sort of random document review that there's no other form for, this would be the form you want to pull out. So the first thing that the Land and Acreage Addendum says is if the buyer has any questions about the property, they're advised to make their agreement subject to the relevant inspections to obtain their knowledge. So if your buyer has questions about anything that was listed before, this form does apply to them. Now, this first part of the form is basic acknowledgement of buyer, it's your responsibility to go ahead and look through all these things. It's your responsibility to find out these tests, and you can make your decisions solely on what you find out to your own discretion. It also has a paragraph that is a hold harmless for the agents. We as agents should not be out at a property of any type, identifying boundary lines, corners, markers, nothing. Anything survey related, we don't know if a neighbor came by and decided to pick up and move a corner post, or if the other neighbor put their fence on the right property line. So we are going to be backing off of that conversation, and paragraph B actually holds us harmless, that what you see may not be what you get. This generally accepted. Now, every other paragraph in the first part of the form just tells the basic ways to have all of these tests done. So for the perk test, it's generally accepted that you're going to want to determine what type of system you're going to use, and you're going to want to hire somebody from the county or somebody who's an expert in this area. We already advise our buyers everything that's in these paragraphs, but it does spell it out right here for them as well. Now, these are also great paragraphs to come back to, because if you are on the selling side of this and you have a buyer come that has done a test of any type and not used one of the generally accepted means of doing that test, then you can actually pull this out and say, actually, that's not one of the ways that you should be making this assumption and making your decisions. So paragraph B does talk about finding things in the well and the water systems, if there are water systems on the property. Also, if there are any tax classifications, as I talked about last week, such as open space, forestry, agriculture, it does have an area where the buyer is advised on what happens if those are currently in place. As we know from last week, anything that is undecided will be on the hands of the seller. So at the closing table, the seller has to pay the back taxes. But this is also a great time for the buyer to decide if they do want to go through with it. Now, if they want to go through with it, paragraph F actually kind of helps guide that way. A cruise is what you consider with a forestry plan or something where you're going to chop down lumber. And what a cruise is, it's where a professional comes out to the property, walks the land, and values the trees and lumber. Now, on-site septic is going to be the same thing. They're going to want to have a professional. They're going to want to make sure that it is done as required by the county when it comes to inspections. And it also gives a little nudge to the buyer here for potentially conducting what they call a purge test, not to be confused with a perk test. What a purge test is like a jetting of the lines, a clearing of the system to make sure there's nothing blocking it and the drain field is actually intact. We'll get to more of this in a minute when I go through all those contingencies. But the last few bullets on here just give sort of an overview to this buyer of what they are and are not allowed to do. If there are crops on the property, the seller does reserve the right to harvest those crops, and then advises the buyers if there are any leased or rented equipment that might extend beyond the closing date. So those are just the general sort of clauses that kind of cover the addendum in general. Now, the contingencies are where we have the best use of our form. So any contingencies that are check marked are the ones that apply. Anything left blank does not apply. For the contingencies, and it says below, but what I did is I actually just chopped up the form. So as I scroll down, that is going down the form. So the contingencies checked below are going to be applicable. And it gives you an opportunity as a buyer to negotiate who actually pays for some of these things. Now, if the seller is responsible for paying for work and ordering that work and it doesn't get done, then that is technically a seller breach of this contract. Otherwise, buyer is responsible for ordering, paying, and conducting those tests that they do on the checkbox. As normal contingencies, these ones also will expire at the end of their timeline, and the buyer does need to give notice of disapproval in order to terminate because of any of these contingencies below. If the buyer terminates, earnest money is refunded to the buyer if they've followed that timeline. And if they don't give notice, as most other contingencies in our contracts, we just move towards the closing table as if that is an acceptance. So the first one is a survey. Now, surveys can be quite expensive. Surveys could be finding corner markers, or surveys could be everything from finding where the property lines are, staking them out, recording it. We don't really know going into things all the time how much has been done previously, but you can check the survey to be completed. I don't know current costs for surveys, but I did have a seller once that paid $3,000 for a survey to be done on his 4-acre property with very complicated boundary lines. So these tests can be quite pricey if the property is not in like a short plat. You're not just finding property corners. Now, a perk test is another option that you can do. This is something that's going to happen with raw land, something that you're planning on putting a septic system into. And what they do with the perk test is find out if that dirt and the ground is suitable to let a conventional or any other type of system have a drain field that actually percolates down for a functioning septic system. Now, what happens with this is they dig some very, very large holes, and in that process, find out what type of dirt is under the ground and see if it is a permeable or non-permeable dirt. Now, because these holes are so big and they're so invasive, the earnest money is actually not going to be awarded to a buyer who fails to fill back in their holes if they were the ones responsible for doing the digging. Right here is just a picture of what some of those holes look like. And what happens is the tractor comes through, digs down 6 to 8 feet down, and then somebody from the county goes down in that hole and looks at the dirt. These tests, again, like I said, can be really invasive. So you can see why filling back in the holes is very important. Somebody can fall in there and get pretty hurt. For an on-site septic, this would be something that already has the septic in place. Now, this is a basic substitute for Form 22S. We do have a lot of contingencies that sort of follow along with other separate forms with this one form. So if you have other uses for the 22LA and there's a septic on the property, you could theoretically also check this box, and this would substitute for your 22S in your contract, keeping you with less forms. Now, there is a slight difference between this one and a normal 22S. There's actually two. One of them being that this one has a choice on who's going to pay for it. And the other one being that it does have the option to perform the purge test, which is the flushing of the lines on that as well, not just a basic inspection. Other than this, it's pretty similar to Form 22S. So if you think that this would be an option for your buyer, feel free to check this and it would do the same thing. The water quality is not quite a replacement for the well addendum, the 22R. It's a good alternative, but not a replacement. So when water quality is being tested, it's being tested to see if it meets the Department of Ecology standards for being safe to drink. It has to be performed by a qualified professional. And those tests do have the option of being submitted to the Department of Ecology for compliance, or just having the test done for informational purposes. Now, there is a pretty big difference between the two of those, and you're going to want to come back to who is paying for this. So if a seller themselves is paying for their own water quality tests, they may opt to actually submit it to the not only to the lab for evaluation, but also to be submitted to the Department of Ecology for compliance. It's going to be a checkbox on the bottle. And if any of the tests come back, they can go back to further evaluation. And I'm going to touch at the end of this, but this entire 22LA, any of those contingencies can have additional inspection timelines. Water quantity is going to be for a well that you need to figure out how many gallons per minute it's going to pump. Now, there might be different uses for the well. So without knowing what that is, a typical residential well will pump around not RPMs, gallons per minute, not RPMs. And then at these as well, we can have buyer or seller pay it. And our number of days would probably depend on your area and how long these tests are taking to be done. The timber cruise is, like I said in the beginning, when a professional comes out to walk the property, and they'll label the types of trees, they'll value the types of trees. And this is one of the other steps that are used for a timber management plan. Feasibility, this paragraph right here is nearly identical to 35F. So you can use this box in lieu of 35F. And if you're using a land purchase and sale agreement, you're also going to have the feasibility checkbox on the first page. One really important thing to keep in mind is when you put a checkbox on the first page with a number, make sure that number is the same number as this. If you are again checking this box, or make sure you're just checking one or the other so you don't have conflicting terms. The irrigation and water is not actually part of the feasibility, although it kind of looks like it with this slide. But irrigation water would be for water rights that are being used, for example, like for crops, irrigation. We don't really see a lot of that here. So you may never actually check this box, but that would be where you check it for these large land pieces that have water sharing. So again, be careful not to check the feasibility box and write in the date that contradicts the purchase and sale or any other place that you've noted a feasibility period. The feasibility can be used for land or residential. You don't have to just use it for land on allowing such research periods. make sure that you use the feasibility contingency for discovering data and researching what it takes to actually build, not anything invasive. This is a non-invasive research due diligence period. And in the irrigation paragraph, this pretty much applies to farmland with irrigation systems. So you'll likely never see these in our area. It does have a checkbox for assignment and assumption. So this would be the same thing as writing and or assigns on the purchase and sale agreement. You can also just check this box. This is the agreement to allow an assignment or assumption. It is not the assignment or assumption. If you end up doing an assignment, then you'll still need to fill out the form to do that assignment. I believe it's 39. There's an attorney review, which is a substitute for the attorney review addendum. And if you're dealing with multiple parties, it would be a great idea to, anybody who has a power of attorney, estates, they may need attorney reviews when it comes to some of our contracts. You could feel free to add this in here. This is just a standard attorney review paragraph. Accessories, you'll probably also not see around here. They're going to be large, like almost commercial farm equipment. And then the CRP program, the Conservation Reserve Program, or the Wetland Reserve Program. There are properties with pretty large wetlands on them. Locally, you'll see them in the wetland green belts of certain plats, neighborhood plats. And in more rural areas, you will see them on individual people's properties. So you can actually designate part of the property for wetland reserve, and it's going to go into its own special program. And if a property that you're purchasing has one of those programs, you're going to want to review those documents and make sure that that's something that you can keep going if you want to as the buyer. So wetlands on property can be put into special categorization or categories for conservation plans similar to open space or the forestry plan. And if the property has information on the title report regarding this, make sure to use the review on the conservation plan and restrictions and check the restrictions with the land in those areas. There's also a crop contingency, and this again is for the large, more commercial type properties. Essentially what it is a seller will go through months and months of cultivating their property, cultivating their crops and land, and when it comes time to sell, they should be able to reap the benefits of what they've worked for all year. So this gives that chance to those sellers if you're dealing with somebody who has farmlands with crops that are cultivated. Also, this is another paragraph that you can find any leases that may be held beyond the closing date. If there's equipment that they're leasing, this is just a way for you to find out all about that. If you are selling a piece of property that has farmland at all, I would highly suggest using the LA just to make sure you don't have any of these things come up as surprises. Because if they do and you haven't given yourself the contingency out, that buyer is going to be stuck taking over those leases if that's what it says in the paperwork. They have a document review period checkbox. And this is a really great place to put documents that really don't apply anywhere else or we don't have a contingency for. I couldn't really think of an example for something you would put in this section, but this is a great place to put additional documents that you know are connected to the property, and the buyer just needs a chance to review them and make sure, everything is good moving forward. Now, all of these contingencies do benefit buyer, and most of them are actually at buyer's sole discretion, giving the disapproval. Excuse me. Additional inspections. Now, this is just like our home inspection. If any one of our are qualified professionals, because every checkbox here is going to be done by a qualified professional. This is not a home sale contingency where a buyer can walk on the property and see if the timber is worth what they want, or a buyer can go do a gallon per minute test on the well, or a septic inspection. This is all done by a qualified professional. So if any of the qualified professionals from the 22 LA find something that they just can't explain and further investigation is needed, they will be able to provide a report stating such. And if they can provide that report that says more inspections are required, then a buyer can exercise their right to use the additional inspection. This is an additional inspection contingency that requires that recommendation be attached. So if you are using the 22 LA and somebody, one of the professionals that has done one of the tests, is requiring additional inspections, you have to attach the request for additional inspections along with the buyer's notice. We don't have a 22 LA form to give notice. There is no form to give for any of these checkboxes if you're using the 22 LA. So it's advised that if you're going to give notice for anything that you've checked in this form, that you just give it on a blank addendum. And, there might be a time where you could apply 90P, which is the feasibility contingency notice, if you've checked the feasibility box. But most of the options on here, you will be serving with a Form 90 if you need to give notice. Paragraph 6 is a tax classification, just like we talked about last week. In fact, it is what we talked about last week. So it is the substitute for 22ZZ of taking it out of a tax classification or keeping it in and having the buyer do a continuance of a plan. This form has the potential to have a lot of timelines, and it can be a nightmare if you're not careful. Additional inspections are for the feasibilities in all of these timelines. And to disapprove, you want to use them, and you want to use Form 90. So thank you so much for listening. I hope everybody learned something new, and have a great day.